Just over a year ago, Barry, a show that's been quite successful on my channel and that I've quite enjoyed, came to an end. I knew as soon as the show concluded that I would be making a final video in the series, and I knew what it would be about. But the writer's strike had started already, and I decided I would not be making any videos centered around major studio productions. So here we are, a year after the show ended, with a better understanding of what the show was building towards. While there's a lot to say about the dark comedy, or comedic drama, or dramedy, I've mostly thought about what the series has to say about redemption. Is it possible? If so, what must we do to achieve this redemption? And how does subscribing to this channel redeem you? To answer these questions, we will look at who are arguably the 5 main characters, what their fates were, and how genuine their attempts to redeem themselves were. We will start with the 3 characters who failed in their redemptions before moving towards the 2 who may have actually succeeded. Of course, it only makes sense to start with the titular character himself.
Starting right. Starting now.
First, we have Barry, the protagonist, the killer-turned-actor we've learned to know and love over the course of the show. The series is almost built on the idea of Barry's redemption. After all, the premise is that he's leaving behind the life of a killer to become an actor. Except, there always seems to be a reason he can't leave. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. Am I right, Sylvia? There's always one more person or one more job Barry needs to take care of. Sometimes it's because of his deal with the Chechens. Sometimes it's because of his friendship with someone. But what we start noticing is that it's often for him. Barry has built this idea in his head that because he's decided to abandon the life of a killer, it should abandon him as well. To Barry, the new redeemed version of himself immediately existed when he decided to no longer continue the career path he was on. Unfortunately, when you've done as much as he has, that isn't quite possible. Not only are there going to be ex-business partners who know who you are, law enforcement is unlikely to let all these cases go cold. Noho Hank, Fuches, and different law enforcement agents continue to haunt him or ally themselves with him throughout the series. This makes it impossible for him to redeem himself in his own eyes. Though, more importantly, they illustrate how he can't escape what he's done scot-free. To Barry, it's obvious that in order to clear his life of all of this, he needs to get rid of these different parties. As you know, he kills Janice and tries killing Fuches, which ultimately results in Mr. Cousineau knowing what Barry did. Unlike the other characters, Cousineau doesn't represent an element of Barry's past life, but an element of the life he's building towards, the life he wants. Killing Fuches is one thing. Yes, it is a father figure, but it's a father figure of his killer self, the version of him he considers dead, and so let his father die with him. Cousineau, on the other hand, is the father figure to his current self. Instead of trying to kill Cousineau, he tries to get Cousineau to forgive him. Of course, this doesn't work as intended, and the 3rd season of the series ends with his arrest. After nearly 3 whole seasons of getting away with it, Barry starts the final season of the series in prison. Still holding on to his vision of a normal life the way he imagined it through the series, he goes to make a deal with the feds. He will rat on Noho Hank. In return, he will get a new identity. At the same time, he's trying to work a deal with Noho Hank to get Cousineau killed, as he believes that if Cousineau speaks to the press, it will draw too much attention, preventing him from starting a new life with Sally. And then, through what's almost pure luck, he escapes prison. He runs away with Sally. He finally leaves the life behind. For 8 years, Barry lives largely isolated from the outside world with Sally and their son John. It isn't ideal, but it's the closest Barry has gotten to the life he's dreamed of. He homeschools their son and does his best to keep him sheltered from the reality of his past, though this often translates into sheltering him far too much. Nonetheless, it feels as though Barry is doing his best to be a good parent, even if the life this provides for John and Sally is missing important elements. But when Cousineau becomes attached to a Warner Bros. Project about Barry Berkman, the killer goes back to LA in hopes to kill his former father figure and acting teacher. This ultimately leads Barry to being shot and dying at the hands of Gene Cousineau. Before the final season started, a friend asked me if I believed Barry would get his redemption. I found this question odd because I was never under the impression that Barry would. It never really felt like an option for him. The best thing he could do to reach redemption would have been to come clean and face the consequences of his actions, but during the show, he did way too much for this to be a real possibility. His fate was always going to be to keep running as long as he could, until the world would eventually catch up to him. The show was never going to give him redemption. And though I found the arrest at the end of Season 3 and the death at the end of Season 4 very shocking, I don't think a happy ending was ever on the cards either. I did skip over an important detail though. Before his death, before Cousineau shot him, it looked like Barry was finally about to come clean. Sally left him with John and told him to do so. And instead of trying to kill Cousineau, Barry sat on his couch, seemingly to talk. But at this point, I don't think this would have led to a redemption he wanted. There would be some level of it, sure, but he had been on the run for so long and hurt so many people that there was no way he could get the life he wanted. He no longer had Cousineau, he no longer had Sally, he no longer had his son, he didn't have any friends left either. His normal life couldn't exist anymore. Even if he didn't die, and even if, in surviving, he somehow didn't serve for life, he would never live the life he wanted. It was over for Barry. It was probably over long ago. Barry shows us that the first step to redemption is to accept accountability. But this must be something we actively do, not a choice we make because all other options are lost. I don't know if his dream life was ever available to him, but in his false attempts for redemption, he brought himself further and further from it. In death, Berkman gains a new reputation. Some confusion is created around the details of the murder of Janet Moss, and authorities come to see Barry as a war hero who was manipulated. I wouldn't call this his redemption, because I don't think this is the type of redemption Berkman cared for. He had already lost everything and was about to turn himself in. He, as a person, isn't redeemed, but his reputation is. Which means his son will one day have a heroic image of his father to look up to. Of course, this does come at the cost for the person now being accused of manipulating Barry. None other than his former acting teacher. Season 3 ended with Cousineau getting Barry caught. It was over. He won. So, how the fuck did we get here? It all comes back to what was always Gene Cousineau's biggest vice, his pride. To Cousineau, there's nothing more important than himself, than his stardom. If the series follows many characters that all show different signs of egocentrism, none show it more than the acting coach. After getting Barry arrested, which he was only able to do because of Jim Moss, he knows it's best to keep quiet, for the sake of the trial. To make sure Barry faces time for everything he's done, it's important they do not speak to the press. Of course, Cousineau does. He gives a one-man show to Lon O'Neill, changing the events of what happened, claiming he was far more in control than he's ever been. In Cousineau's narrative of events, he had Barry wrapped around his finger. If the acting teacher said jump, the killer would ask how high. As the audience, we know this isn't true. We know the fear that overwhelmed Cousineau, and that he worried for his life and the life of his loved ones all throughout. As Cousineau's audience, O'Neill doesn't know this and takes everything at face value, which will eventually bite the acting teacher in the ass, as the performer also mentions the money that Berkman had offered him. Though, that doesn't happen just yet. Nonetheless, we already see how his sense of conduct will play a role in his unmaking. Just not yet. Cousineau gets kinda lucky on that front, though not without a cost. Jim Moss has a one-on-one with Lon, which scares the reporter shitless. He won't talk, to anyone. Moss's intention wasn't to keep Cousineau safe, but this already works in the acting coach's favor. Then, when Barry breaks out of prison, Cousineau is sent into hiding, which prevents him from further incriminating himself. He's gone for 8 full years, apparently on a journey of self-discovery, and it almost seems to have worked. When he comes back to Hollywood, originally, it's actually to prevent the Barry Berkman movie from being made. He thinks that's the worst thing that can happen, especially if Barry's story is told. But coming out of hiding brings Barry to Los Angeles, and in trying to torture the killer, Jim Moss learns about the money Barry gave his father figure. He now thinks that Barry may not have been behind this. Maybe it was Cousineau. The detective decides to play the actor's greatest flaw to his advantage and hires someone to play the role of Daniel Day-Lewis's agent, telling Cousineau that the actor wants to come out of retirement to play him. Cousineau's ego skyrockets, and he's back to his old self. Unfortunately, the movie can't be greenlit unless they have a big enough name playing Berkman. They're thinking of getting Mark Wahlberg for the part, but Wahlberg doesn't want to play a cop killer. Feeling that his chance to be portrayed by Daniel Day-Lewis is fading, Cousineau now starts spreading the story that Berkman was flawed and misguided. This, with his previous account of being a master manipulator who had Barry wrapped around his finger like men for Sabrina Carpenter, painted a new narrative for Jim Moss. Cousineau was behind it all. The detective successfully turns everyone against the retired acting coach, even his own son. Gene's life is falling apart, and he is now facing prison time for the crimes he committed. Really, he's facing this time for having too big an ego. Then, right as Barry is about to come clean and clear the actor's name, Cousineau sees the man he's feared for the last 8 years. The man he believes is here to kill him. He shoots Barry in the head before Barry can do anything to him. He believes this to be an act of self-defense. In reality, law enforcement and the public perceive it more as a move to keep Barry from telling the truth, an attempt to tie up his last loose end. For this, and for the murder of Janice Moss, which he did not commit, Cousineau is sent to prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. Over the series, Cousineau was kind of the only character on a clear path towards redemption. We saw his flaws, but we also saw how much he was doing to overcome them, to prove better, not just for the others, like Detective Janice Moss, but also for himself. For a good part of the series, we saw the benefits that came with that effort. He struggled from time to time, showing signs that he was being tempted by his ego, though he mostly found a way back. But then, the later half of the season happened, and we understand that Cousineau cannot be redeemed at this point. Even though he had improved over the series, that means nothing overall if he can't continue to uphold what he's learned. Cousineau is here to remind us that the path towards improvement, towards redemption, is not a one-way street. We must maintain the changes and values we now hold. It's normal that growth isn't linear, but if we find ourselves returning to behaviors or habits that hurt us and those around us, this is not a sign to give up on our own selves. We have to try to catch ourselves in the habit and get back up from there, even when it feels like we might have fallen too far down. Because we're not our weakest moments, but we aren't our strongest ones either. Even after his strongest, Cousineau still fell. Similarly, he also reminds us that the regression can happen, and we must pay attention to our current state in order to make sure we do not return to the person we wanted to grow from. Change doesn't mean anything if we make the point we started at the point of consistency. Okay. In my first Barry video, I said something that ended up being a bit embarrassing in hindsight. The final relationship I want to discuss is maybe the healthiest consistent relationship in the show. It certainly has problems of its own, but it is far more functional than the others due to the compassion presented in it. Admittedly, yeah, that aged like milk. Clearly, I was wrong, but, and maybe this is my pride and or ego talking, I do think that my assessment was fair for what I knew at that point. There was a genuine care between the two of them, and they were on the same page, kinda, at the time. Season 4 changes that. After the incident with his wife and finally being reunited with Hank, Cristobal wants to turn a new leaf. He wants to go legit. They're going to go into the sand business. They might be able to get a monopoly over the construction sand in the area. They need to make a few alliances, but this would lead them to become very rich. On the other hand, Hank doesn't let go of the criminal life easily. He was never very convinced by this idea, but this becomes especially true when he learns that his best friend, Barry, is in prison. At first, this translates to wanting to free his friend. He claims the killer would be an integral part of the operation and that they simply can't do it without him. Cristobal doesn't buy it. He recognizes Barry for what he is, an anchor stuck in the criminal world. So long as Hank holds on to him, he'll be stuck there too. Luckily, Hank's relationship with Barry would soon end. The lovable Chechen criminal would soon learn that his BFF is a snitch, feeding information to the FBI. Information about the Chechens and the Bolivians. Barry needs to die. On this, Cristobal agrees. Unfortunately, the assassins they hire to do it fuck up, and Barry ends up breaking out of prison due to this fuck up. Meanwhile, another problem remains. Hank does not want to move forward with a sand operation, and he may have no other option but to go against Cristobal's plans as Batir confronts him, telling him to join the Chechen mob once more, or he and Cristobal will be killed. Hank betrays his lover and kills their men. He explains to the Bolivian that he had no choice, but his significant other can't stay with him after this betrayal. Hank begs him to stay. He knows that if he doesn't convince Cristobal to join, he will be killed. Cristobal was killed. So much for the healthiest relationship in the show. 8 years later, Hank is the owner of an extremely successful sand importation business called Noho, named after he and Cristobal's name as a couple. In the center of the office building stands a statue of Cristobal. Now going by The Raven, Fuches has recently been released from prison and is meeting with Hank. The meeting serves as a bit of a thank you and as a reward to Fuches for keeping quiet during his time in prison. Fuches makes some demands, and most of it seems to be going well. Though, he does request that Hank bring him Barry, which the Chechen claims is impossible. The meeting then takes a turn for the worst, as the Raven drunkenly congratulates Hank on eliminating Cristobal and taking the operation for himself. But Hank claims the death was an accident. He is clearly in denial of the role he played in taking his lover's life. This creates tension between the two men and ultimately results in Fuches taking a compound owned by Hank and starting a bit of a gang war between the two. The climax of this conflict occurs when Hank captures Sally and John, Barry's son. He sets up a meeting between his squad and the Ravens, leading into a standoff. Having been beat every time until this point, he has little hope of winning. So Fuches makes him an offer. Admit he killed Cristobal, and there will be no shots fired. Crying, Noho Hank finally admits that he killed his lover. But he goes back on the deal. The two gangs start firing at each other, and Hank ends up dying. In his last moments, he reaches out to the hand of the Cristobal statue. Trying to hold his lover one last time, his hand meets the lifeless metal. He dies holding on to the statue, which is now covered in bullet holes. Once again, Cristobal was shot due to Hank's actions. If Cousineau reminds us that we are not solely defined by who we have previously been, Hank shows us that we can't ignore it either. To grow requires the acknowledgement. It requires the push. I think, ultimately, he was even further from redemption than Barry. Because while Barry thought he could step away from this life with no consequences, Hank thought he could live the best of both worlds. He could hold on to his criminal ties, be in charge of his mob empire, without having to acknowledge what he did to get there. The times he got his hands dirty. To Hank, these are not things he's done, but things that happened to him. By removing his own autonomy from his story, he's also shedding himself from guilt, almost turning himself into a victim. And when someone forces him to face the role he played, he lashes out. It prevents him from ever finding redemption as a character, leaving him reaching to hold something he can't have. Ironically, I think the person who killed him did find redemption. Like his surrogate son, Fuches starts the season in prison. In fact, Barry's idea to be an informant for the FBI comes from Fuches, who is doing the same thing by giving them information about Berkman. Though, upon seeing the killer with him in prison, he decides to mend things between them. Then, when he learns that Barry is working a deal for himself, one that would involve spilling the truth around Noho Hank's operation, which Fuches was very involved in, he contacts Hank to let him know, knowing that the Chechen mobster will likely try to kill the actor. Throughout the series, the relationship between Barry and his father figure often fluctuated, particularly on Fuches' side, as he would often take his surrogate son's actions very personally, even when his son didn't intend them to be. Therefore, any action his son took that would take them further from one another was a betrayal and an action that had to be met with violent response. All that to say, this was not the first time Fuches tried to snitch on his son, and now, it was not the first time he arranged to have Barry killed, nor would it be the first time he changes his mind on this, because of course he did. Knowing Noho Hank acted on his advice and put a hit out on Barry, Fuches warned the guards that it was about to happen. Hell, he warned anyone that would listen. Nobody really believed him, and if anyone did, they didn't care. But after the failed attempt on Berkman resulted in the killer's escape, the guards suddenly had a very big interest in what Fuches had to say. They needed leads. They wanted to know where Berkman could have gone, who he could go looking for, but he said nothing. They tortured him for days. He was near death. He still said nothing. It was the type of loyalty and courage that had not been displayed by the character yet, and it gained him quite a bit of respect in prison. He finally lived up to the reputation he seemed to believe he should have. 8 years later, when he finally leaves prison, his number of followers has dramatically increased. The Raven's reputation was well known and well respected. Someone who could withstand the amount of torture he did and refuses to snitch after all that must be tough as nails. He was loyal to Barry and to Noho Hank. He arranges a meeting with the Chechen mobster and illustrates to his men that there is quite a benefit to being loyal to him, as his deal with Hank gets them all living rather comfortably. It also involves getting Barry to him. It seems as though his intent is vengeance, as he stayed loyal to his son but his son left him there, though this is never explicitly said. Then, he makes the previously mentioned comment about Cristobal. The deal falls through. His conflict with Hank begins, although the conflict is mostly one-sided. Fuches and his men are really just living the high life and biting back whenever Hank tries to attack them. Unfortunately for Hank, their bite is much more aggressive than his. When he finally gets his hands on Sally and John, He's able to get Fuches to act, especially as he knows that this will almost certainly attract Barry as well. When Fuches shows up, it seems his intentions are to use Sally and John to get Barry to him, but when the shooting starts, his priorities change. He wants to get the two to safety. They seem to be the only three characters to survive the shootout, and Fuches makes sure that John safely gets back to his father, before disappearing into the night. This is the last we see or hear of his character. In the final season of the series, Fuches redeems himself. The redemption the character needed wasn't for his past crimes, nor was it for his current ones. If anything, he's probably a more dangerous criminal now than he ever was during the series. His redemption was about his relationship with his son, with Barry. Despite being a father figure to the series' protagonist, and very much seeing the protagonist as his son, Fuches was very rarely loyal to his son. He was rarely loyal to anyone but himself. He finally learned to be a good parent to Barry, to protect him. He tried saving him and then went through so much to make sure his son gets away. As for the stuff with Noho Hank, when I originally watched the season, it was my belief that Fuches wanted revenge on Barry for leaving him there. I still think this is highly possible, but seeing that the first few episodes gave us Barry and Fuches' earliest interactions, I really do feel as though this season meant to put a focus on their father and son relationship. So I wonder if it was truly a desire for revenge, or a desire to reconnect with his son. Either way, in the final episode, Fuches saves Barry's child and leaves him with the protagonist. He may not have been a great father for most of his life, but by the end, he was. He protected his son and saved his grandson's life. Seeing as Barry died and John moved, it's safe to assume Monroe wouldn't have either of them in his life moving forward. But that's okay. He didn't do these things for himself. He did it for them. That's why he's redeemed. And this leaves us with the only other survivor from the standoff at Noho Ball. I, like many others, have been harsh on this character in the past. Though, I did believe that Season 4 showed us a side of her that did a lot to flesh out the character and make her feel more understandable. Especially as the first 4 episodes of the season introduced us to her mom and dad, and even showed us her take on her mentor's path by becoming an acting teacher. Looking back at it, knowing how the second half of this season would become, I think this served to do more than inform us on why Sally became the way she was, but also to make us wonder how John would turn out. As I've said in my previous Barry video, link in the description, Sally became her parents. She became her mother in the way she treats others and looks down at others, while becoming Cousineau, her more present and proactive father figure, in the way she treats herself. Will John become like her if she treats him the way her mother treated her? This feeling is especially reinforced by the fact that Barry, while a lot more active in John's life than Sally's father was, plays a bit of a similar role to the one her father played. He's certainly less passive and more willing to confront Sally, but that doesn't mean the dynamic is all that different to the one her parents had. Meanwhile, Sally herself spends a few episodes of this season barely invested in the life of her husband and son. In fact, she's drunk more often than not by the looks of it. Nothing wrong with a glass here or there. My friends would tell you that I'm definitely not one to judge that, but by the way she uses it to numb her life, you could tell it isn't healthy for her or her son. I can't really say I blame her though. After her show got cancelled and learning that her friend retooled her idea to make it her own, Sally learned that her ex-boyfriend was the killer, was greeted by a family that couldn't care for her, was rejected by her own students, and learned that she would likely never find work in the field she wanted. She felt alone and unloved, which her relationship with her mom implies she's felt this a lot in her life. She returned to the one person she knew would love her, the killer. Now she lives in hiding, far from everyone she knows, having to keep her life secret from everyone, even her son. Sally is in a deep depression, and her mental health is greatly deteriorating as illustrated by the hallucinated attack on her home. This state prevents her from being the mother her son deserves, as well as the person she needs to be for herself. Luckily, she comes to realize that this has all gone too far, and heads back to LA to warn Cousineau of what's going to happen. She doesn't succeed in doing so, and tries turning herself in instead. She's done hiding from what she and Barry have done. This doesn't work, and that leads to her kidnapping at the hands of Hank. From there, she does her best to protect her son until the conflict is over. Once the two of them are released to Barry, she tells her husband that it's over. She walks away from him, telling him to turn himself in. The series then cuts to roughly 7 or so years later. Sally is now an acting teacher for the high school John attends. The theater students just finished their production of Our Town. She's happy. John asks her to go spend the night at a friend's place, and she gives her approval. She heads home alone, seemingly satisfied with how her life turned out. In this final season, we see Sally in her lowest moments. We see the consequences of years of emotional neglect and possibly gaslighting from her family. And we see that this, with the removal of the one form of self-expression she felt allowed to have, left the character empty. Depressed. As I've discussed in my previous 2 Barry videos, we also see how she would then repeat these behaviors to others, with this season showing us how she was absent to her son. But she breaks this cycle. She finds a way to cut through the generational trauma, to be the mother her son deserves. To do that, she needs to come clean. She needs Barry to come clean. And so, she does. She tries to get him to do the same. To me, Sally has the most clear-cut redemption of all the characters in the show. We see her put aside her lies, overcome her depression, guide her family to what's right, and by the end of it, it seems that she has finally made peace with herself. Doing this would require conquering her ego. I believe she did. We even come to understand that she prevented her son from watching the Barry Berkman movie. I believe this to be a decision to protect him from the misinformation she knows it spreads. She shows us that even when we're at our lowest, there's a way up. It may not be easy, it may require a lot of self-work, but it's possible. I know this may not be everyone's take. I've seen people say that she should have investigated what her son was going to do at his friend's house, and in that very scene, he tells her he loves her, but she doesn't say it back. That first part seems like a bit of a reach to me. When I was a teenager, I would have gotten very annoyed with my mother if she asked me in detail what I was going to do with my friends. Generally, so long as she knew that I was out with friends and had an estimated time of return, she would be satisfied. As for the second part, I do think that that's a valid criticism to some extent, though if I can make a bit of a reach, do you know how hard it is to get the average teenager to say that to their parent? I don't think it's something he would have said if their relationship wasn't very strong. Maybe that's just me. Overall though, I do believe Sally achieved redemption in a way that no other character in the show did. Over the course of one season, she went from a character I generally disliked to the one I was rooting for the most. After watching their different journeys towards redemption and seeing how many characters failed, I think it's clear that this isn't something we do for the rewards. We do it to better ourselves and to be better to those around us. Barry failed because he was doing it for the reward. Cousineau failed because he put personal rewards over the importance of others. Hank failed because he refused to see that he needed to change. Whereas Fuches and Sally succeeded because they recognized that they had to be better for themselves and those around them. This is very likely my last Barry-related video, unless my channel starts struggling again. So, thank you for watching, especially those of you who watched all 3. The series really shaped my channel and played a big role in growing my subscriber count. Roughly a fourth of my subs come from talking about this series, time of recording, so I hope I talk about other shows and movies you may enjoy. Let me know your thoughts, and please recommend those shows and movies. Who knows? I might make a video about it.